Hello, welcome to PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series. My name is Caitlin Rose Seiler, and I'm the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Mercy Harris, a recent graduate from the Department of Biology at the University of Saskatchewan, will be speaking about wetland conservation for the birds, foraging diet and insecticide exposure in prairie swallows. I first heard Mercy speak about her work at the recent Prairie Conservation and Endangered Species Conference, and I was amazed by her passion and enthusiasm. So I'm really delighted that Mercy can present in our speaker series today. Before we begin, I'd like to state that we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I would like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. Just a few items before we get going. I'd like to note that PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series is a monthly presentation about anything to do with prairie conservation or species at risk. And I'd like to invite everyone to join us for a webinar about identifying and analyzing the diet of prairie amphibians by Joe Voss from the University of Lethbridge on November 29th at 12 p.m. As always, you can register for our webinars through the PCAP website. Past webinars can be found on the PCAP YouTube channel. A reminder to all of our listeners out there, as there's over 100 registrants, you'll be muted for the duration of the webinar. But if you have any questions during the presentation, just type it into the Q&A section of the webinar dashboard at any time, and questions will be answered towards the end. Feel free to vote other people's questions if you have the same one. I'd like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by our presenting sponsors, Canadian Forage and Grasslands Association, North American Helium, Nutrien, Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association, and SaskTel. And without further ado, I'm pleased to talk about today's presenter. So Mercy grew up in Eastern United States before moving to Quebec to study environmental biology at McGill University and later to Saskatoon to do her master's in biology at the University of Saskatchewan. Mercy completed her master's degree studying swallows in January of this year and is currently working for Birds Canada. When not hot on the trail of birds, Mercy enjoys gardening, public speaking, and spending time with her family. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Mercy.
Thanks so much, Caitlin. I'll just get my screen shared here quickly. And all right, if anyone has any problems, please give a shout, but otherwise I'll go ahead and get started. So thanks, Caitlin, for the introduction. I'm really happy to be here and talk about my master's work with foraging, diet, and insecticide exposure of prairie swallows, and how wetland conservation and the importance of wetlands is a common theme that stretches across many of the topics I'm going to talk about today. To jump right in, today I'm talking about a group known as aerial insectivores. And to sort of define this term, aerial insectivores are birds that feed on insects while they're flying. So they're out flying around, flapping around, and they're eating insects as they fly. And aerial insectivores include birds and groups of birds that are quite well known, such as swallows. So for example, barn swallows are a quite well-known example, but also birds that are quite diverse in terms of their morphology and also things like their ecological traits. So if you look here, there's nightjars that are aerial insectivores, there are swifts, there are flycatchers, and these birds all have different and diverse traits, such as feeding on different types of aerial insects, building their nests in different locations, and far more. But despite the diversity within this group of birds, one shared thing amongst many species in this group is that these birds began declining in around the 1970s to 1980s. And you can see on this plot here that the pink line at the bottom is aerial insectivores, and collectively as a group, aerial insectivores have declined the most of any North American breeding birds. Now, these declines began quite synchronously in many species of aerial insectivore, despite the fact that these birds are so diverse in terms of their life history and ecology. So because the declines were fairly synchronous in these species, the question has been raised about whether declines could be related to the group's shared reliance on aerial insect prey, and potentially whether something could have been happening with their aerial insect prey that is affecting these birds. Now, as I was starting my master's project and thinking about, what factors might be relevant to these birds and their aerial insect prey, I'm based here in the prairie. So the question that I was spending time thinking about was, what are some factors here in the prairies that could potentially affect these aerial insects that birds rely on? And being based out of Saskatoon, the one factor that comes to mind very easily in these landscapes is agriculture and the huge scale of agriculture that's present across much of the Canadian prairies. Now, conversion of grassland and prairie into crop fields and into agriculture is nothing new, with a lot of that conversion having happened 100 or even 150 years ago. But one factor and one trend that is potentially relevant to the time scale at which aerial insectivore declines have been happening is the trend of agricultural intensification. And agricultural intensification simply refers to the effort to get as much yield, as much crop out of a given unit of area as possible. Now, agricultural intensification can take many different forms, but some things that often go along with intensification are things like the removal of uncropped habitat. This could be drainage of prairie pothole wetlands, this could be taking out of shelter belts, etc. There's also been the wide-scale development of industrialized monocultures, where an entire quarter section or even a whole section is often planted in the same crop, and there's relatively low crop diversity across the landscape. And thirdly, intensification of agriculture has often meant that there has been a great increase in the amount of agrochemicals that our agricultural fields are relying on, specifically increases in pesticide inputs. So these are just some examples of how agricultural intensification can sort of manifest itself. And I think it's worth thinking about how some of these things could potentially be affecting aerial insectivores or the insects they rely on. So first of all, if we want to sort of think at the big landscape scale about how removal of uncropped habitat could affect these birds, if you're a barn swallow or a tree swallow or any other aerial insectivore trying to nest and breed in agricultural habitats, one of the main activities you're going to be doing is foraging for insects. And as habitat type is changing with agricultural intensification, that potentially affects what habitats are available for you to forage in, to look for insect prey in. And you might have to adjust your foraging habitat use in response to what sorts of habitats are becoming more common, such as crop fields, or what sorts are becoming less common. If we want to zoom in a little bit more closely, we can think about how this might affect the types of insects that are available for birds to forage on when they're out and about trying to provision themselves and their nestlings. It's well documented that as agriculture intensity changes, insect communities also change. So it's possible that as agricultural intensification takes place, there are simply different types of insects that are or are not available for aerial insectivores to eat, and they might have dietary changes that are associated with this. Lastly, if we want to zoom into even a smaller scale about how these changes could potentially affect birds, we can think about the question of diet quality and whether things like the increasing use of pesticides could potentially be reducing the quality of the insect prey that birds are feeding on. So for example, as insectivores, they could be eating insects that have been exposed to sublethal doses of insecticides and might have insecticides in their tissues that are then passed on to the bird. This could reduce the quality of these prey because then the bird has to, devote metabolic energy to breaking down those compounds, or even conceivably it could cause direct harm to the bird itself. I hope that by thinking about those different scales and different ways that just a few examples of agricultural intensity could affect insects and affect birds, I hope that makes the point that this is a really big topic and that the question of whether agriculture could affect insects in ways that are relevant to aerial insectivore declines is a huge question that no one study can answer. So as a graduate student, my goal was just to try and find one piece of the puzzle that I can answer to contribute to our understanding of agriculture, insects, and aerial insectivores. And the question that I chose to try and answer with my master's work was whether agricultural intensity affects aerial insectivore feeding ecology in Saskatchewan. In pursuit of thinking about this question about feeding ecology, I wanted to look at a couple different aspects and a couple different scales of feeding ecology, much like I walked you through with those slides. So first of all, I want to think about what types of foraging habitats birds are using. Specifically, I want to think about whether they're using cropped habitats, other upland habitats that aren't cropped, such as pastures, versus their use of wetlands and prairie pothole wetland as foraging habitat. I also then want to zoom into the smaller scale of thinking about their diet and seeing whether diet is affected by agricultural intensity. One of the things I am particularly interested in thinking about diet is the relative contributions of emergent aquatic insects versus terrestrial insects in their diet. So here in the prairies, we're fortunate enough that we have a lot of pothole wetlands that, especially early in the spring and summer, produce phenomenal amounts of emergent aquatic insects that have their larval stages in the water, but then emerge as adults. So these are things like midges, dragonflies, damselflies, etc. The reason I'm interested in thinking about diet in relation to emergent versus terrestrial diet inputs is because there's evidence, at least in tree swallows, that there are nutritional benefits to eating emergent aquatic insects. So I was particularly interested in investigating that aspect of diet in relation to agricultural intensity. Lastly, I kind of wanted to look at the finest scale of feeding ecology by considering that question of diet quality and whether birds are being exposed to insecticides through their diets, and if so, how much, and what sort of landscape factors do or do not affect exposure. When I'm thinking about these three components of feeding ecology, I wanted to compare and study these in not just one species of aerial insectivore, but to think about different species of aerial insectivore and whether different species are responding in the same or different way to agricultural intensity. If you think back to the very beginning of this presentation, I talked about the tremendous diversity within the aerial insectivore guild. So it's reasonable to believe that not all aerial insectivores will respond to agriculture and any potential changes in the same way. So I chose to do my work studying feeding ecology in two species with different ecological traits. First, I chose to study tree swallows, which are reported from other parts of Canada to be fairly specialized on emergent aquatic insects and to forage a lot in wetland habitat. I wanted to compare this to barn swallows, which, again, in other parts of Canada, are reported to be less specialized and to spend more of their time feeding in terrestrial habitats like crop and pasture. The last thing I need to tell you about for my study before I can get into what specifically I did is about the study system I worked in. I worked at 17 sites south of Saskatoon that were spread across working agricultural landscapes. And in these sites, the purpose of working at so many sites was to try and capture sites across a gradient of agricultural intensity. For my study, I considered two measures of agricultural intensity to be local wetland cover and local crop cover. We know that wetlands are frequently lost as lands become more intensively cultivated, so high wetland areas were considered to be lower intensity and vice versa. And likewise, I considered crop to be a metric of agricultural intensity because as land becomes more intensive, you lose those non-cropped habitats and there tends to be higher crop cover. I conducted all this work in 2020 and 2021, and I did it during June and early July when birds were on the nests and actively having nestlings there that they needed to provision and try and feed. All right, to start off with sort of the broadest scale of what I wanted to look at, foraging habitat. How could these large landscape level changes be affecting birds? I decided to study this using GPS tags deployed on female swallows during the chick rearing period. You can see here that it's a little fingernail-sized GPS tag that sits on the back of the bird and has an antenna. And these GPS tags recorded the location that a bird traveled every 10 minutes, allowing us to create what I think are really amazing detailed maps about where a bird is going. So you can see on the map that the location of the nest is marked with the blue star, and every location that the GPS tag recorded the bird is in yellow. And by overlaying this on satellite imagery, we can see whether the bird was foraging over a wetland, over a pasture, over a crop field, etc., and get this really remarkable level of detail. Before I tell you exactly what I found from this GPS data, let's just take a moment to think about what our predictions or hypotheses might be based on what we know about these two different species. First, we know that from other regions of Canada, tree swallows are preferring to forage near wetland habitat, whereas barn swallows don't seem to have that same preference. So I'm going to predict that these species will differ in accordance to their use of wetland foraging habitat. However, for both, I'm going to predict that because there are known insect community changes that go along with intensifying agriculture, that these birds are going to avoid highly intensive areas and avoid cropped uplands when they're foraging. Let's see if these hypotheses actually panned out for me. Okay, in terms of what habitats the birds are using, my hypothesis that birds would not use crop as much was correct. Croplands seem to be avoided by these species, and what I mean by that is the birds used cropped areas less than they were locally available in the landscape. So for example, 24% of tree swallow GPS points were overcrop and about a third of barn swallow points were. As we all know, in much of South and Central Saskatchewan, there's more than a quarter to a third of the land planted in crop. So the fact that these birds were using it a lesser amount than it's locally available suggests that there's something that they're avoiding when they're going out and foraging. In terms of what habitats birds did use, wetlands appeared to be important foraging habitat for both tree and barn swallows. Again, both species used wetlands more than they were locally available, which in this study system was around 3%. So both species seem to be spending more time in wetlands than you would predict based on availability alone, indicating that there's probably something that they prefer about foraging in these areas. One thing I want to highlight that I think is of interest is the interaction between the foraging habitat that birds are using and how far they are from their nest. Considering distance from nest in sort of movement ecology studies is interesting because in a time like this, when the birds are actively trying to provision their nestlings, feed many hungry mouths, we can predict that birds are not going to spend the time and energy to go to far points when they have these high demands of feeding nestlings. We can predict that they're going to not go to those further distances from their nests unless there's something really beneficial about the habitats they're using when they're going far. What I found in my analysis is that the preference that birds displayed for foraging in wetland habitat was actually stronger when they were further from their nest. And in fact, if you look at a plot like this, you can see that many of the points when they were far from their nest were over top or near wetland habitat. This suggests that there's something highly beneficial about wetland foraging habitat that makes it worth the time and effort of these birds to go far, to expend that energy to travel further and provision for their nestlings and to feed themselves as well. So adding further evidence that wetlands appear important for foraging. Lastly, in terms of the question about whether agricultural intensity affected these birds' foraging, I can say that both species responded in a similar way to wetland presence. Specifically, in areas where there was lower intensity, more wetlands presence, birds did not avoid cropped habitat as strongly as in areas where there was not wetland presence. The exact reason for this is not clear, but it suggests again that wetlands are important in determining birds foraging and that perhaps there's something about having wetlands present that maybe birds can forage over, feed off, maybe subsidize themselves a little bit, such that they don't have to so strongly avoid cropped areas when those wetlands are present. In terms of what some takeaways from this foraging chapter might be, I think the first thing I want to emphasize is that wetlands do appear to be important foraging habitats, and wetland presence appears to affect swallow foraging. And this indicates that even though wetlands aren't large landscape features and they have been lost in many areas, that they do seem to be key to the foraging ecology of these species. Both species seem to have the similarity in what sorts of habitats they use, specifically wetlands, and what types of habitats the species avoided, so cropland. And the fact that both species responded to these habitats similarly, responded to changes in agricultural intensity similarly, indicates that these birds are, at least in this study system, behaving a little bit more similarly than we would expect based on their species ecology from other regions. So that was an interesting development or an interesting finding that wasn't necessarily expected when I started thinking about foraging. To zoom in a little bit at a smaller scale and think about what sorts of insects these birds are catching and whether that's affected by their foraging, I wanted to study diet composition in these birds. The way I studied diet composition, is I collected fecal samples from both adult and nestling swallows and sent the samples to the University of Guelph, where they went through a process called DNA metabarcoding. And this is basically where DNA from the feces is extracted and compared to a database so that you can identify what DNA from which insect species were present in the fecal samples, and therefore that indicates that those species were consumed by those birds. It's important to say that this sample or this method for looking at the diet samples is not a quantitative method. It only really allows me to see whether a species was present in the diet, not how much it was present. So whether it was, 30% of that bird's diet or whatever. But it's still valuable because it still allows me to look at what types of insect families birds are eating. And it allows me to address questions that I'm interested in, such as what types of insects are coming from prairie wetlands, that question of emergent versus terrestrial insect contributions to diet can be addressed through this sort of data. So I wanted to look at that question of whether the amount of emergent aquatic insects was being affected by local landscape, again, because there are known to be nutritional benefits, at least for tree swallows, in eating emergent aquatic insects. I also wanted to look at overall diet composition and see whether this differed between species or according to local landscape. And because for this part of my study, I had data from both adults and nestlings, I wanted to bring that consideration of age into my study to see whether there was any difference between diet in adults and nestlings or emergent insect consumption in adults and nestlings. Once again, let's think about what we might hypothesize based on what we know about these species. It's known that tree swallows in other parts of Canada are fairly specialized on emergent aquatic prey, so I'm going to hypothesize that there's a statistically significant difference in the amount being eaten between the two species, with tree swallows eating more and barn swallows eating less emergent prey. For both species, however, I'm going to hypothesize that because of the known nutritional benefits of eating emergent insects and how this is important to nestling growth and nestling development, that adults of both species are going to selectively provision their nestlings with emergent aquatic prey because of those benefits. Starting off very broadly in terms of what types of insects I detected in the samples, the top families are shown here, and specifically for both barn and tree swallows, the #1 and #2 most frequently detected insect families were both cranefly families. Craneflies are a type of emergent aquatic insect, so they're coming off of prairie wetlands. Other frequently detected insect families included housefly and housefly type insects, and for tree swallows also had a fairly decent presence of some types of beetles in their diet. But overall, these families were fairly similar across both barn and tree swallows in terms of what was being eaten. Based on that, there was actually no statistically significant difference in either diet composition or emergent and aquatic inputs between barn and tree swallows. Both species overall ate quite similarly. However, where there was a difference was according to adult versus nestling breakdown. Nestling swallows of both species ate more emergent aquatic insects than adults did, and nestlings overall had distinct diet composition from adults, suggesting that there is some sort of difference in the way that adults are feeding themselves versus provisioning their young. Just to build on this a little further and think about whether agricultural intensity affects diet, surprisingly, I found that diet was not affected by local crop cover, but it was affected by local wetland presence. And this was a bit surprising because in the prairies, we tend to think of crop cover and wetland cover going hand in hand. As areas become more intensive, there's crop expansion and there's wetland loss. But this suggests that even though those things, we think of them together, it's really wetland presence rather than crop presence that's affecting the types of insects that these birds are eating and are provisioning their young with. What does this mean in terms of takeaways for this? I can tell you this slide is going to look a lot like the takeaways from the foraging chapter, because I think this data continues to support the idea that wetlands are important for the feeding ecology of these birds. Wetlands appear to be prey sources, and the presence of wetland again seems to shape overall diet composition, indicating that wetlands play an important role. Once again, as well, there does seem to be a high amount of similarity, at least in this study system, between species. We expected that tree swallows would eat a lot of emergent aquatic insects, but from this data, it suggests that barn swallows are at least opportunistically taking advantage of emergent aquatic insect resources and eating overall the same or at least similar types of insect prey as tree swallows, and likewise having their diet composition also affected by wetland presence. The last part of my project that I'm going to talk about is this even more fine-scale examination of whether the types of insects that birds are eating could potentially have, the quality or their nutrition value affected by insecticide exposure. I'm going to give a little bit of extra background into insecticide before I jump right in, just because it's something that I was less familiar with when I began this project. So I wanted to make sure that we all in the audience have the necessary sort of understanding before I jump into results. To start off, as I mentioned at the top of this presentation, growing pesticide use, including growing insecticide use, is something that has really been well documented across North America. And as you can see in this figure, even in just the 10 years encapsulated here, there's been an increase in the proportion or the percent of total land treated with insecticide, really across a lot of Canada, but including the prairies. A large reason for this increase in insecticide use has been the development of neonicotinoid insecticides. Neonicotinoids are a group of insecticides that have a similar structure and a similar way of acting upon insects to cause neurological symptoms and eventually death from those neurological symptoms. Neonicotinoids were developed in the 90s, and as you can see in this plot, have really ballooned in how much they're used. Globally, they're the most commonly used group of insecticides. This plot is from the US, so that's why the crop types look a little bit different than what we grow here in Canada, but the trend is much the same, with really ballooning growth in insecticide and neonicotinoid use in Canada. Now, neonicotinoids, I'm sure most of us has probably heard the term bandied about, but you probably have also seen them, because if you've ever seen a seed that's coated with a color like you see here in this picture, those are seeds that have probably been treated with a compound, potentially neonicotinoids. And that is because neonicotinoids are systemic insecticides that in the prairies and in Canada are generally applied to crops through seed coatings. So the idea with these being systemic insecticides is that when the seed germinates, it's able to take up the compound in the seed coating and get systemic protection that way. The challenge with coating seeds and using insecticides in this way is that not all of the active ingredient in the seed coating is taken up by the plant. As you can see in this figure, a lot can move throughout the landscape. It's well documented that there is a lot of neonicotinoid landscape contamination, and it's known, for example, that it can move to things like field edges, and neonicotinoids can be taken up by non-target plants and be passed on to non-target insects that feed on those plants. It's also known that it can move into prairie pothole wetlands and even into the tissue of those insects that live in prairie wetlands. If these are emergent aquatic insects, that then provides a way for those insects to sort of export that insecticide contamination when they emerge from the water and potentially enter the food webs of things like insectivores, such as aerial insectivores. So because of this large potential for landscape contamination, I wanted to investigate, are aerial insectivores being exposed? How much are they being exposed? And what are sort of the factors that drive their exposure? And can that tell us anything about where these compounds are entering the food web? To get at these questions, I collected blood samples from swallows. As you can see in this picture, this isn't a swallow, but it shows exactly what I did, where you just take a very small amount of blood and analyze that for neonicotinoids. Now, it's important to note that blood samples reflect only recent insecticide exposure because birds will be able to metabolize compounds like insecticides fairly quickly, within 24, 48 hours at the most. A lot of the compounds are completely broken down into metabolites. So this picture that I'm getting from my data collection is really a snapshot of recent exposure. With that in mind, I'll start by showing you sort of just basic stats about what sort of percents of exposure I found. But before we do that, last time I'll show you this slide, I promise. Let's think about what we might hypothesize for these species. Because we're hypothesizing that exposure is going to be dietary in nature, based on the similarities of the diet and foraging of barn and tree swallows, I'm going to hypothesize that these two species will have similar overall exposure. Likewise, if I'm hypothesizing that, again, exposure is dietary through their prey, the difference in diet between adults and nestlings is going to lead me to predict that there will be a difference in exposure based on age. For both species, I'm also going to finally hypothesize that in areas with more intensive landscape, more crop cover, that there's going to be higher exposure simply because insecticide compounds are being applied more in the landscape, so there's more potential for contamination. What I found was that amongst barn swallows, there was a higher percent of adults than nestlings exposed, and the same is true for tree swallows. Now, these percents may not look super high to you, and they don't look super high to me either. But again, I think we need to keep in mind that this is only a short-term measure about what the bird has been exposed to over the last day or so. So that's not to say, for example, that the 60% of adult barn swallows where I didn't detect any insecticides are never exposed. It's just on that time when I sampled that bird, it had not been recently exposed. Whereas in reality, there's probably a pretty good chance that that bird is exposed at some time during the summer, just not at that particular minute. So these sort of numbers suggest that we might be dealing with more of a low-dose chronic exposure to insecticides in the study system. In terms of what compounds were detected, this is just a little bar plot where on the y-axis, it's the proportion of all the detections within the groups that are along the x-axis. So those are just groups by species and by age. And you can see that amongst pretty much all species, all ages, the two most frequently detected compounds were the neonicotinoids imidacloprid and thiamethoxam. And thiamethoxam was found in 83% of the birds that had at least one insecticide present, so really a very commonly detected compound. In case you're curious, thiamethoxam can be found in quite a few agricultural products, such as those listed, as well as even in some household insecticides that are marketed for things like killing ants, and brands that we are familiar with, such as Raid. So really widely used compound. To get into the meat and potatoes of what actually affects exposure, I wanted to look at the quantity of different insecticide compounds, both in terms of presence and absence, and in terms of concentration. So was something detected? And if something was detected, was there things or factors that affect how much was being detected? So I'm going to bring back the same factors I've been considering in a lot of my presentation, things like species, age, and agricultural intensity as covariates of interest. But I'm also going to add in here diet as an element. Again, we're predicting that diet is how these birds are ingesting insecticides, and I have this great data set about what birds are eating, so I wanted to test different variables related to diet to see what, if anything, was related to insecticide exposure. I also wanted to bring in covariates that relate to temporal factors. As I mentioned up top, I did this study over 2 years, so I wanted to look for any differences in exposure between year and also in day of year. So whether as the season progressed and you get further into July, for example, whether that has any effect on the amount detected. When I ran my models and did my analysis, the factors that shook out as being important really seemed to be age, diet, and those temporal factors. And I'll walk you through now how they seem to affect exposure. As a reminder, the two most commonly detected compounds were thiamethoxam and imidacloprid, so I'm going to look at these compounds individually to see what factors affected the exposure of birds to these specific compounds. So starting off, thiamethoxam had adults being more likely to be exposed to this compound than nestlings were. There was also importance of the temporal factors, with birds being more likely to be exposed in 2021. And amongst birds that were exposed, there was greater magnitude of exposure in 2021. For thiamethoxam, there was also an effect of diet, with greater insecticide exposure being linked to birds that ate more terrestrial insect prey. Imidacloprid, however, as the second most frequently detected compound, has a bit of a different story. There was no effect of age on imidacloprid. There was an effect of year, but there was also no effect of diet on imidacloprid exposure. And I think I'll just take us on a very brief tangent to see if we can make sense of why these factors are relevant, for one compound, but maybe not for another. So as background, these two compounds are both neonicotinoids, but they're not used in quite the same way. So specifically, thiamethoxam is more of a current use insecticide, whereas imidacloprid was the first neonicotinoid developed. And even though it is still used, it's not used as much, at least in this study system where I worked. So as a result, thiamethoxam is found throughout the landscape, whereas imidacloprid is more sort of in the background as in sediment and soil. Because of this, the way I like to think about these results is that thiamethoxam is something that's being applied in seed coatings every year, has a fairly predictable pattern of how it's being used. It's being applied in a certain way in certain locations that is probably going to lead to more predictable ways in how it enters insects and how those insects potentially pass on the insecticides through the food web to the birds. By contrast, imidacloprid as sort of a background compound doesn't have necessarily those same predictable patterns, and therefore it might make sense why the factors like age and diet didn't have as much of an impact, because there's not such a clear and predictable way that this compound in the sediment and in the soil is entering the food chain. So I thought that was a little bit of an interesting finding, that these two compounds had these different ways that they were potentially entering food chains, affecting or exposing birds, etc. What does this mean in terms of my question about the extent of insecticide exposure and the factors driving it? Well, this study revealed that there is a fairly decent percent of birds that are exposed to insecticides at any one time, sort of 30 to 40% range for adults, 10 to 20% range for nestlings. And it seems that age, year, and diet were main factors affecting it, at least in thiamethoxam, which was the dominant insecticide detected. However, I think if we consider these answers and these factors in a little more depth, we may be even able to sort of answer a bonus question that wasn't 100% one I was setting off to answer at the beginning. And to think about this bonus question, I'll remind you of this diagram I showed at the beginning of this section, where we talked about how there are multiple potential ways that insecticides could be entering insects and entering food webs and getting passed on to birds. I think if we think about these questions, we can answer the question, or at least think about the question of where and in what habitats might insecticides be entering food webs. First off, there was a strong effective year on the exposure of both thiamethoxam and imidacloprid, with more exposure being found in 2021. 2021 was a hot and a dry year compared to 2020. And as a result, many seasonal wetlands that birds might ordinarily be using dried up early in the season, and it's reasonable to believe that birds would be therefore spending more time foraging and feeding on insects from terrestrial habitats and areas that aren't wetlands. So that factor and that relationship between year and exposure suggests that maybe that greater use of terrestrial habitats in the drought year could be related to exposure. The fact that terrestrial insect consumption itself was linked to greater exposure, at least for thiamethoxam, further lends to the idea that maybe terrestrial food webs are a greater source of exposure, as does the fact that adults were more likely to be exposed to insecticides, and we know that adults have distinct diet composition from nestlings and specifically eat more terrestrial insects than nestlings. So taken together, this suggests that maybe the insecticides applied in terrestrial areas are passed on to insects in their tissues and potentially passed on to birds. Of course, the obvious caveat that goes with this is there was no direct link between the proportion of local crop cover and the extent of exposure. That, I hypothesize, could potentially be because maybe there's just a sufficiently large amount of background exposure in terrestrial habitats that birds are getting exposed not only from cropped habitats, but also from pasture habitats, from areas that are field margins, etc. And that maybe it's not specifically terrestrial habitats in the form of crop, but just terrestrial habitats in general due to that background exposure that's causing this. Now, my last slide for the insecticide section is because I know a lot of you are probably thinking, okay, Mercy, this is great, but what does this really mean? Could insecticides potentially be directly harming birds? I get this question a lot, and I'm here to tell you that I can't really tell you the answer to that. This was beyond the scope of my study, and really we don't have the toxicology data necessary to fully answer this, because when we're looking at concentrations and exposure needed to cause harm, we have to have data to compare it to. And that sort of data is usually, number one, done in a lab. Number two, if it's done in birds, it's done in a small set of species such as bobwhite, mallard, house sparrow. And a swallow is not a bobwhite, a mallard, or a house sparrow. And it's usually done by giving the bird an acute dose of insecticide. The swallows in our study system are out in the real world. They have a lot of environmental factors that could be affecting their exposure. They are probably more chronically exposed than acutely exposed to insecticides. So we really can't draw parallels between the few lab studies we have and what concentrations would be needed to cause harm in wild birds. But what I can do is I can sort of put the detections or the mean detections into context along a spectrum about what has been detected in other species of birds. There are some species of birds where the mean insecticide concentration in blood is lower than that which I detected in swallows. There are some species that are about the same, and then there are some species that are even much higher. So even though this might not be a super satisfactory answer in terms of whether this could cause direct harm, this situates the insecticide concentrations that I detected within a reasonable realm that's comparable to other species of birds. And I think this sort of just goes to highlight that there's probably enough of a background level of exposure or of contamination in our landscapes that many different types of birds are being similarly exposed to these compounds. I'm going to use my last few minutes here to just try and quickly see if we can circle back to the questions I sought out to answer at the beginning of the presentation and make some linkages between foraging, diet, and insecticide exposure. To start off, the question that's very fundamental is what habitats and insects are birds exploiting? Because without characterizing these things, we're really not in a position to say whether agriculture could potentially be relevant to these birds. Overall, it seems that wetlands appear to be important to their feeding ecology, both as foraging habitat and as sources of prey. Both barn and tree swallows had similar behaviors, suggesting that there is some shared importance, or at least shared opportunistic exploitation of these resources. We can also say that these habitats and these sources of prey are contaminated enough with insecticides that birds are exposed, at least a certain proportion of birds are exposed to insecticides. However, I want to be clear that just because wetlands and intensity appears to be relevant to the feeding ecology of birds, that doesn't automatically translate into the success or the productivity of birds. I'm not saying that in areas where there aren't wetlands for birds to exploit, that the birds are going to have nest failure, they're not going to have successful reproduction, that they're going to suffer. That's sort of a different question. And that was something that was actually explored by a companion study in the same study system at the same time as me, but that was not within the scope. So I just want to be clear that just because wetlands appear important for foraging and feeding ecology does not mean that they're necessarily automatically linked to the success of these birds. In terms of the question about the effects of agricultural intensity, it appears that intensity did affect foraging and diet, so those are things like how wetland cover drove those things, but not neonicotinoid exposure in these birds. Again, that might be related to the fact that there's just a high enough background level of contamination in the landscape that you're not able to directly link exposure to specific land covers. And lastly, the question about what role species traits play in all of this is something that I really enjoyed thinking about in this project. Overall, the feeding ecology and responses to intensity of these species were much more similar than I expected based on what has been reported about their ecological traits in other regions. We expected that tree swallows would use wetlands and emergent prey, but not so much barn swallows. This could potentially be simply an opportunistic thing for barn swallows, where we have wetlands that are available in the prairie landscape and they're just taking advantage of it. It could be something else, like wetlands are one of the few remaining natural areas in intensive landscapes and birds are drawn to it because of that. But I think whatever the reason, it emphasizes that we're just starting to understand the full suite of species that rely and use prairie wetlands, and how many more are out there that we're just starting to appreciate now. I'll end with, as any good scientist, by saying there's always more work to do. This could be taken in a lot of different directions. I think the question of sort of sublethal potential effects of chronic exposure to insecticides on birds is an interesting one, but there are many grad students out there who I'm sure will continue this work, and I'll be interested to see what they do regardless of where they take it. So with that, I'll turn control back over to Caitlin. I'm happy to answer questions in the time we have remaining. And if you would like, you're always welcome to reach out to me. There's my email. And without further ado, back to you, Caitlin.
Thank you so much for the awesome presentation. We have a whole lineup of questions already, which is great. So let's see here. The first one from one of our attendees, they say, I believe some insecticides or neonicotinoids are now banned in Europe. Will the same ever happen in Canada? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, that's a big question, and you're right. There has been a lot of phase out about 10 years ago in Europe of neonicotinoids for most uses. They're still able to be used in some situations, but largely been phased out. As to whether that will happen in North America, that's a big question. There was recently a reevaluation of a lot of neonicotinoid insecticides by the pest management regulatory bodies at the federal level. And at first it was expected, that was looking like the uses of neonicotinoids would be potentially quite reined in Canada. But there was a little bit of a surprise semi-reversal of that, where they really only restricted their use in a few contexts for a few crops. So I think if there was a trend going in the way towards phasing them out, it would have happened, a few years ago. The fact that it does not suggest that we're nowhere close to any sort of change like that. But I will just always make the point that neonicotinoids are the insecticides of today, but there's always the next generation of insecticides coming out. Things like rhinoids are already in use. They're not as big as neonics yet, but we always have to think about what's going to replace a compound as well.
For sure. A listener named Ross is wondering if Birds Canada is part of this project and discussion. It looks like it would be a good fit within the bird friendliness index.
Yeah, so Birds Canada is currently in the process of sort of developing a national strategy for aerial insectivore recovery. I was actually in one of those meetings earlier this morning, and they're considering things like agricultural practices in that. They're still in the early phases of developing that, but there has definitely been mention of incorporating, just things like integrated pest management, messy field ideas into the grassland bird friendliness index. So I would say that they're aware and they're working on it.
Awesome, that's great. Um, in your research, did you assess mortality rates at all?
I did not assess mortality rates. The companion study that I mentioned that was focused on sort of productivity, reproduction, chick survival did focus on survival and survival in the post-fledgling period. But I did not look at adults. And the question of post-fledgling survival is arguably a little bit different than mortality. So I would say post-fledgling survival is the closest thing to mortality that I know of, having been studied.
Okay, perfect. And is the swallow exposure percentage a higher value than the effectiveness percentage of the seed treatments for crop protection?
Effectiveness percentage for crop protection?
Of the seed treatments for crop protection.
Okay, I'm not sure exactly what the person is getting at there, but I guess maybe just to speak to the percents that were detected, or like the percents of birds where it was detected. In my presentation, I said that the percents might look a little bit low to people like me, and that's because in some situations there have been studies where 100% of birds that are studied have neonicotinoids in their blood. There was one study just a couple years ago east of Saskatchewan that found that. So the percents can vary widely. Not sure quite what that person's referring to, but I guess for context, the percents in this study were a little bit lower than the percents in other studies.
Thank you. And an attendee named Jim is wondering, can you use the GPS data to separate out foraging activity versus locations that are just during movement from nest to foraging location?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's something that was definitely thought about in this project. I guess to start, we automatically removed locations that were within 20 meters of the nest, because a bird, if it's only 20 meters from its nest, is not foraging, it's just coming and going. So we removed those. Beyond that, it does get a little bit tricky because I am making the assumption that these GPS points reflect where the bird is foraging, because it's during that peak provisioning period when the adults are under so much pressure to provision. But that said, if there were obvious locations in my data where it was, the bird was not moving, the bird was maybe going to roost in the evening instead of foraging, those are removed. But that definitely is an assumption that's built in a little bit to the data.
Perfect. How do you define a wetland? Is it a permanent water body or water in the spring or present only in certain years?
Yeah, great question. And I thought about including that in my presentation, but cut it for time. So I'm glad that came up. For the purposes of my study, I was considering wetlands to be areas that have water at the time when I was doing my research. So end of June, first week of July is when most of my GPS data was from, because that's when the chicks were in the nest and the birds were out and about foraging. So for my purposes, it was any type of body that had water at that time based on satellite imagery. However, obviously, there's different types of wetlands. There are some, especially in 2021, that you would call wetlands, but they were dry by the end of June, and they were not really considered wetlands for the purposes of my study, because I figured functionally they're probably not, having those emergent insects in the same way when they're, a dry patch of mud versus actually having water. So that's how I define wetlands in the scope of my project. But of course, there's a whole wetland classification system ranging from everything from permanent to saline to seasonal to ephemeral and everything else.
Yeah, it's a very complicated question.
It is.
Um, the next question, since barn swallows build mud nests, any thoughts on potential exposure at that point in their life cycle? Has anyone ever measured the chemicals in their nests?
That's interesting. And it's not something that ever occurred to me. I have not. I'm not aware of any study of, looking at those levels that might be of things like imidacloprid that are in soil and in sediment. Um, that would get into the question of whether by just moving mud, in their mouths, building their nest, or having the nestlings sit in the nest, whether there'd be the potential for exposure that way. I would think that's probably not going to be a big exposure pathway because you would have to, then the bird has to have enough contact with the sediment in its tongue or through its skin in the nest that it's absorbing it. But something I never considered. So interesting idea.
Hmm. The next question, do you think weather extremes also contribute to the declines as well as impacts on insect prey?
Yeah, I think if you're kind of thinking big picture about aerial insectivore declines, weather extremes are really important, especially with climate change. We're having extremes in terms of both spring weather. So, the birds are coming back. And then if there's a surprise cold snap, that's a big source of mortality that's known for swallows. In the summer, it's the same thing. If you have really extreme hot temperatures, as we did for a couple days in the 2021 study year, that can definitely cause nestling mortality in some situations. So in terms of insects, I think the same thing applies. As temperature and precipitation patterns change and alter, when seasonal wetlands are filled and when they're dry, that is, I think, an important linkage, because we know that bird productivity declines later in the season as, for example, emergent aquatic insects become less available. So I think all the potential for weather and climate to interact with the production and emergence of insects, plus the potential for mortality on the bird side, is something that's definitely relevant to keep in mind, as are, just how these things can feed into sort of stochastic happenings.
Thanks. And then Raquel says that she's part of Pesticide Free YEG and has been learning more about BTI and knowing about non-specific pesticides. And Raquel says, I think BTI could be another reason for reduction in insectivores. Do you agree? Or do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, it's not something I know too much about. I'm aware that there has been a little bit of discussion around that within sort of the literature, not a lot, but some. So I would simply leave my comment at I've heard it mentioned, so there might be something to think about there, but I can't really say more than that.
Okay, no problem. Um, So Jody says, I find it interesting that they are being exposed to the pesticides by consuming insects that are contain sublethal levels of pesticides. Can insects develop resistance to neonics?
Yeah, resistance is always a big question in the realm of pesticides. So yes, they can. And it could also, these insects could have insecticides in their tissues, both because they've developed resistance or because they were feeding on the plant at a time when there was not enough still systemic insecticide in the plant to kill them, just enough to, make them a little wobbly for a couple hours. So I would say, yeah, it could be from resistance for sure, absolutely. And also just, they took not enough of a chomp of the plant to get a fully lethal dose, either because of the amount they ate or the time at which they fed on the plant, according to how much was in the plant.
Thanks for that answer. We still had a few questions coming in, but I know that we're running out of time. And I just wanted to forward on a few comments here. So Penny says, great webinar. I learned a lot from your presentation today. Love swallows. We used to get them in our yard in the small town, but unable to get them now. We do get many purple martins who eat plenty of insects. We also build a couple of tree swallow houses and put near a slough adjacent to untouched fields that we take down in the fall and then always have a nest in the house. And She says, thanks again. And I tried to do my part to help birds. So I thought that was really
Oh, that's
lovely.
awesome. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's been lots of other people that have written in that say, great presentation. We all enjoyed it. Um, yeah, great talk. Too true. Excellent presentation and thank you. So great context for discussion. Great job. So I just really wanted to reiterate those amazing comments from people. So thank you so much. This was a really, really great presentation. Mercy.
Yeah, thanks for having me and for tuning in, everyone. And like I said, if you ever want to chat swallows, feel free to send me an email, mercy.harris@usask.ca.
Absolutely, that's great. I know we weren't able to get to everyone's questions in such short time, but people can reach out to you directly if they would really like an answer. So that's awesome.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you. And to all of our listeners out there, thanks so much for catching today's webinar. When you leave, there'll be a quick 1-minute survey. If you don't mind filling that out, we really appreciate it. And we go through it looking for ideas for future webinar topics. And then also we can use it to report back to our funders as well. And yeah, with that, thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.